The courtroom was silent, the air tense with anticipation, as the doors creaked open and an unexpected figure stepped through. It wasn't a music executive or an industry insider. It was George Clooney, not the smiling face from red carpets or the polished voice from humanitarian summits. This was a different man. Dressed in a dark suit, jaw clenched, hands steady, Clooney took the stand and changed the tone of the entire trial. He wasn't here to defend a friend or shield Hollywood secrets. He was here to confess. What followed was not a typical celebrity testimony. This wasn't about a bad contract, a private affair, or a political statement. Clooney came forward to expose a hidden network, a world beneath the surface of fame, literally. He described a secret cave buried beneath a world-famous theme park, a place known to millions but hiding an elite, ritualistic underworld. Parties cloaked in mystery, masked celebrities, figures known only as nuggets, limbless individuals presented like props in an orchestrated spectacle. Clooney painted a picture that wasn't just shocking, it was disturbing. He admitted he never participated in these rituals, but his silence made him part of the machine. "There are things I've seen," he said, "things I can't carry anymore." The setting was surreal. Imagine George Clooney at 2:00 a.m. following GPS coordinates to a theme park's underground chamber. He wasn't starring in a thriller. He was living one. He described being driven in a black SUV through deserted industrial zones, entering through unmarked service doors, and walking through fluorescent-lit corridors past silent guards who knew his name without ever asking. Then a metal hatch opened, and what lay behind it was something out of a dystopian film. A cavernous room filled with gold-plated cups, ambient music, and powerful people dressed in robes. Athletes, politicians, billionaires, all participating in a ritual cloaked as a party. But what made this moment explode in the public's imagination wasn't just the details. It was who was saying them. George Clooney wasn't some disgruntled actor or anonymous whistleblower. He was Hollywood royalty, standing in a federal courtroom, admitting to the world that for over a decade he knew something was wrong, and he said nothing. He didn't come to save his image. He came to tear it down, to tell the truth, no matter what it cost. As the transcript rolled out piece by piece, Clooney's words started doing something rare. They shifted the cultural lens. This wasn't about Diddy anymore. It was about power, silence, and the cost of staying relevant. Clooney's testimony didn't just open a case. It opened a door into the most secretive corners of fame. And once that door was opened, there was no going back. George Clooney didn't stumble into Diddy's circle. He was drawn into it deliberately, over time. It started like most high-tier Hollywood connections, an invitation here, a party there. At first, it felt like being chosen, like being let in on a secret society where access alone was a currency. The kind of parties most people only hear about in rumors, hosted in villas where NDAs are signed at the door, where no one brings their phones and everyone knows to speak in code. For Clooney, these gatherings were more than networking events. They were like golden tickets into the private worlds of entertainment's elite. When Diddy invited you, you didn't ask questions. You showed up. That was the rule. That's how it worked in their world. He described those first few years as intoxicating, the sense of exclusivity, of knowing you were part of something others couldn't even imagine. It was like being knighted in a secret fraternity. There were private island retreats, mountaintop chalets, after-hours clubs where the guest list was tighter than the Oscars. It was mysterious, seductive, and George Clooney, one of the most recognized faces on Earth, found himself intrigued not just by the access but by the game. He admitted he liked the feeling at first, the unspoken rules, the thrill of being in the in crowd. It was flattering. It was addictive. But everything changed in 2013. That was the year he received an envelope. No return address. Inside, a single card. No message, just GPS coordinates and a time, 2 a.m. It felt like a prank at first, like some immersive performance art. But then came the text from an unknown number. Follow the coordinates. Wear black. No phone. And just like that, Clooney's curiosity pulled him in. Curiosity, he later admitted, was stronger than caution. So he went. He was picked up in a black SUV, driven through back alleys and deserted industrial streets. There was no music, no conversation, just silence. Eventually, they pulled into the parking structure of a major theme park, one known to millions, a place associated with childhood joy and wholesome entertainment. He didn't name it, but everyone could picture it, a place where families made memories. Now a portal into something much darker. They entered through a service door hidden near a loading bay marked Staff Only. Clooney described the hallway as something out of a Cold War bunker. Flickering fluorescent lights, concrete walls, twisting corridors. He passed multiple security checkpoints, each one manned by silent guards who didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. Clooney said they weren't regular bodyguards. They were colder, sharper, efficient. They knew who he was before he even spoke. Eventually, they reached a reinforced metal hatch. It hissed open like a submarine door, and what lay beyond was unlike anything he had ever seen, a vast underground chamber carved into the earth. Clooney described the lighting as soft and ambient, the music pulsing like a slow heartbeat. There were dozens of people inside, celebrities, politicians, athletes, all dressed in luxurious robes, sipping from gold-plated goblets, mingling as if they were in the VIP room of some ancient Roman gala. And then he saw them, people with no arms, no legs. Some wheeled in, others resting on plush pillows. Clooney said they were referred to casually as nuggets. No one flinched. No one reacted. It was like they were furniture, like props. They weren't there as guests. They were the centerpiece. He recalled the moment vividly, how he asked someone what was going on, and the person laughed. "Don't worry," they said. "They volunteered. It's part of the fun." But Clooney didn't laugh. He didn't feel entertained. He felt sick. He said it didn't feel like a party. It felt like something else, something designed. Before anyone could go deeper into the chamber, they were handed a non-disclosure agreement, thick, legal, enforced by what Clooney recognized later as a private intelligence firm. If you didn't sign, you didn't go in. That was the rule. That's how they controlled who got in, and more importantly, who stayed quiet. Clooney refused to sign, and instead of being asked to leave, he was quietly escorted to a side lounge, a glass-walled room with a perfect view of the main chamber. He said what he saw that night never left him. Celebrities he once admired, behaving like animals, powerful men and women, people with public images built on compassion and morality, drinking and laughing while the nuggets were passed around, presented, paraded. Clooney didn't touch a thing. He drank one whiskey, stayed seated, and left as soon as he could. But the damage was done. He thought it was a one-off, a twisted event he could write off as a freak incident. But he was wrong. More invitations came, more coordinates, more after-hours, locations, and each one, he later realized, was somehow tied to Diddy. Every dark corner, every locked door, there was always a thread that led back to him. That first night in the cave shifted something inside Clooney. The initial awe was gone. In its place, dread. His perception of Hollywood, his colleagues, his mentors, even himself, began to fracture. He started noticing things he had previously ignored. The way people flinched at certain names. The way conversations abruptly stopped when certain topics came up. There was a code, a language of silence, and he had started to speak it without even realizing. He remembered the cognitive dissonance vividly. How could the same people who gave moving speeches about justice and human rights Stand in a room like that and sip champagne while someone blindfolded and limbless sat silently at the center of a red velvet cushion. How could he, George Clooney, actor, activist, husband, father, sit behind a glass wall and do nothing? These questions began to haunt him, not just at night, but in the quiet moments of his day. On set, at home, at charity galas. It was a new kind of guilt, one not born from action, but from inaction. He hadn't participated. He hadn't joined in, but he hadn't stopped it either. And in a system built on silence, that was enough. This was the beginning, the moment. George Clooney stepped through that service door and into the cave. He wasn't just witnessing a secret. He had become part of it. And though he left that night physically untouched, something inside him had changed. He had seen the truth, and even if he tried to forget, the cave would follow him. Because once you've looked into that darkness, you never really look away. George Clooney didn't just describe a disturbing scene. He exposed a system, one carefully engineered to control, silence, and protect itself at all costs. It wasn't random. It wasn't messy. It was structured like an operation. From the moment someone entered that world, everything was monitored, calculated, and enforced. The first layer of that control was the NDA. Clooney described it as more than just a document. It was a gatekeeper, a silent contract with heavy consequences. It wasn't something a regular attorney drew up. It was thick, aggressive, and backed by a private intelligence group. Signing it didn't just mean you couldn't talk. It meant you were in. And once you were in, they had you. Before stepping deeper into the underground chambers, everyone was made to sign. Clooney refused. But even that refusal came with a consequence. Instead of being ejected, he was pushed sideways, literally, into a side lounge where he could watch everything. Through glass but not participate. That was part of the test. Not just whether you signed, but how far you'd go. What you'd tolerate. What you'd keep quiet about. That's what Clooney meant when he called it a loyalty system. Silence wasn't just survival. It was currency. The more you saw, the quieter you were expected to become. And if you talked, you weren't punished with violence. You were erased. Projects stalled, calls unanswered, connections dried up overnight. In Hollywood, that's worse than violence. That's death. He started noticing the patterns, the whispers, the subtle exclusions, phone calls that suddenly stopped, films that went from green lit to canceled without warning. A director he'd worked with for years pulled out of a project without explanation. No one said it was because of Diddy, but everyone knew. Clooney called it the silence. It followed him like a shadow. It wasn't loud. It wasn't direct. It was strategic. It was effective. There were surveillance elements, too. Clooney described a guest book, a real leather-bound ledger placed at the entrance of the cave. Everyone signed it. Not with fanfare, but with the casual familiarity of routine. That's how ingrained the process was. He didn't sign, but he remembered some of the names above his on the page. Names that, if revealed, would shock the average American household. That book wasn't just for registration. It was insurance, proof, a tool for mutual destruction. Because in this system, what protected everyone was the knowledge that anyone could be exposed. If you talked, you didn't just burn yourself. You burned everyone. The control extended beyond documents and books. Communication between participants was encrypted, cloaked in vague texts, anonymous notes, and code phrases. Clooney revealed that after that first cave night, he received more invitations, never from a named sender, always the same style. A black card, a time, a location. And with each one, the message was clear. You're still in this, whether you want to be or not. The most disturbing aspect, though, was what Clooney called the psychological framework. This wasn't just about hiding dark behavior. It was about building a hierarchy, a place where being complicit made you safer, more connected, more successful. Rewards came in the form of roles, publicity, protection. But the punishments were subtle and devastating. Say no to the wrong person, and your entire career would vanish without explanation. Ask the wrong question, and your name disappeared. From studio lists, Clooney said it wasn't just fear of being blacklisted, it was fear of being forgotten. In his words, fame is oxygen. They control the air supply. He detailed the circle, the core chamber of the operation, as more than just a physical location. It was symbolic, a place of ritual, repetition, and hierarchy. The room was circular, mirrored walls, velvet floors. Everyone wore masks, elaborate, animalistic, sometimes grotesque. No names were used, no introductions. Clooney said it created a sense of detachment. If no one had a name, no one had accountability. It felt theatrical, but not in a playful way. It was performative control. What happened inside the circle followed strict rules. There were rotations, who stood where, who observed, who participated. It was ritualized, almost like a ceremony, not chaotic, not impulsive. Clooney noted how the masked attendees, despite their status, followed those unspoken rules without hesitation. It wasn't just about indulgence. It was about belonging. Being seen in the circle was proof you were part of the inner pyramid of fame. And that visibility was a weapon. You weren't just there for yourself. You were there so others could see you there, so you'd never speak. Because if you did, everyone else who was there could go down with you. Mutual destruction. That was the real insurance policy. Clooney also revealed the presence of a recording booth, something most attendees ignored or pretended not to see. A glass-walled room elevated above the main chamber with red blinking lights. Cameras rotated slowly from above. No one ever acknowledged them, but everyone knew. Someone was always watching, documenting, maybe for blackmail, maybe for control, maybe just because they could. Clooney never found out who ran the booth, but he never forgot it. Another key piece of the control system was security. Not just traditional guards, but men with military posture and blank expressions. Clooney said they didn't act like nightclub bouncers. They acted like they were trained. For war, they didn't ask questions. They didn't smile. They didn't react. They knew who belonged, and they knew who didn't. Clooney emphasized that they weren't there to keep the peace. They were part of the ritual. They watched without flinching, even when the most unsettling moments unfolded. But the system didn't end underground. It extended into boardrooms, studio lots, media outlets. Clooney spoke about how powerful publicists and PR firms operated like a quiet mafia. If someone got too close to the truth, rumors would be drowned out by glowing coverage. Scandals would be buried under awards show appearances and charity work headlines. It wasn't just about keeping Diddy's name clean. It was about protecting the entire ecosystem. If one part fell, the rest would be exposed. The manipulation wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was calculated, strategic. Every interaction, every silence, every handshake meant something. Clooney said he had been approached during a lunch by a high-level producer who casually referenced the nuggets, smiling as if it were an inside joke. That's when he realized this wasn't a secret. It was an institution. And the real threat wasn't exposure, it was complicity. Because once you were in the circle, the only way out was silence or disappearance. Clooney's testimony didn't just reveal what happened in the cave. It exposed the machinery that kept it running. Contracts, rituals, fear, and above all, the knowledge that everyone had something to lose. That's how they got you. That's how they kept you. George Clooney didn't wake up one day and decide to become a whistleblower. For years, he tried to walk away quietly, to step back from the darkness without making waves. But in Hollywood, There's no such thing as a clean exit. After that first night in the cave and his refusal to sign the NDA, Clooney thought distancing himself would be enough. He declined future invitations, stayed off the radar, and told no one what he had seen. But silence wasn't immunity. It was only delay. Slowly, the effects began to show. Projects he had already signed on to started stalling with no explanation. Longtime collaborators stopped calling. Directors and producers who had worked with him for decades suddenly became unavailable. Endorsement deals disappeared. Studio executives who once chased his approval now returned his calls with vague deflections or not at all. At first, it felt like coincidence. Then it felt coordinated. Clooney described it as a cloud, an invisible force that followed him, dimming every opportunity, quietly closing doors before he even knocked. What was most disturbing was the absence of confrontation. No threats, no warnings, just a vacuum. And in that vacuum, paranoia grew. He began questioning everything. Was this deal canceled because of the script? Or because of who he refused to align with? Was the producer really going in another direction? Or was it code for something darker? The lack of clarity was the point. It wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare. Clooney began losing sleep. He described long nights lying awake, thinking about the cave, the masked faces, the camera blinking above the circle. He'd play every interaction back in his head, wondering who knew, who watched, who decided he was no longer worth protecting. That psychological toll bled into every part of his life. He began turning down invitations, skipping events, avoiding conversations that felt too close to the edge. He wasn't hiding a crime. He was hiding the truth. And that truth weighed heavier each year. Insomnia turned into anxiety. He became hyper-aware of his surroundings, checking cars behind him, scanning rooms for exits. He wasn't sure if anyone was following him, but he wasn't sure they weren't. That uncertainty lived under his skin. And Clooney wasn't the only one. He shared the story of a young actor, someone he had mentored, who confided in him at the Cannes Film Festival in 2016. The actor was shaking as he spoke. He'd been approached to attend one of the caves. He declined, politely but firmly. A week later, his agent stopped returning calls. A month later, a major project he was cast in was suddenly restructured. Within 6 months, his name was gone from the trades. The actor now teaches drama at a middle school in Oregon, not because he lacked talent, but because he said no to the wrong invitation. Clooney described this not as an accident, but as a message, a quiet warning to others. Play along or disappear. As the world kept applauding his on-screen achievements, Clooney lived in duality. To the public, he was still the star, the humanitarian, the golden boy of Hollywood. But behind that smile was someone living with a secret so heavy it chipped away at his sense of self. He began documenting everything. He kept a journal, every strange call, every canceled meeting, every vague message from an unnamed PR firm urging him to distance himself from certain people. He wrote it all down, not because he planned to go public, but because part of him feared he might need evidence. Someday, that quiet resistance became his lifeline. He started building a private archive, notes, guest lists, photos, receipts, every piece of the puzzle he could collect without drawing attention. Not to destroy anyone, but to protect himself. He knew what happened to people who spoke out without a shield. They didn't just lose roles. They became punchlines, headlines, cautionary tales. And as his fears deepened, he took steps to protect what mattered most, his family. After receiving a sealed envelope in 2017 with no name, just a black wax stamp marked with the letter P, Clooney didn't take chances. Inside were photos, glossy, disturbing images from inside the cave. One, which he later showed in court, featured a nugget positioned on a red pillow, surrounded by robed figures. But what shook Clooney most wasn't the imagery. It was the face closest to the nugget, someone America idolized, someone he had worked with. That's when he realized it wasn't over. It was still happening. And now, someone was sending him a message. You were there. You saw it. Choose a side. He hired private security, moved his children out of the country for 6 months, turned down film offers that required too much public exposure. He didn't tell anyone, not his agent, not his closest friends. He went dark. Not because he was running, but because he was waiting, watching, gathering strength for what he now knew was inevitable. Clooney described this period as a life lived in 2 dimensions. On red carpets, he smiled, gave speeches, posed for photos. At home, he sat in silence, replaying surveillance footage sent to him anonymously. Grainy video of masked celebrities, nuggets in place, the slow turn of a recording camera. No sound, just motion. Ritual. Diddy walking to the center, removing his mask, and staring directly at the camera, as if he knew it was being recorded. That was the moment Clooney stopped wondering if he was imagining it all. It was real, and someone wanted him to remember it. That internal collapse never made it into magazines, but it was there, in every script he declined, every interview he avoided, every smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Clooney wasn't just protecting a career anymore. He was protecting himself from becoming another erased name, another industry ghost. He wasn't a victim of violence. He was a casualty of silence. But even as the walls closed in, Clooney never forgot the young actor at Cannes, the one who whispered his story and then vanished from the spotlight. That memory stuck with him, haunted him, because for every one of him, still visible, still powerful, there were a dozen who didn't have the same shield. And the more he thought about that, the harder it became to stay silent. He had the evidence, he had the story, but more than that, he had the responsibility, because surviving the system isn't the same as escaping it. And for George Clooney, silence wasn't survival anymore. It was complicity. The silence that cloaked George Clooney's life finally cracked open in the most unexpected and chilling way. A package, unmarked, no return address, delivered directly to his Los Angeles home in late 2019. The world was on the brink of shutting down, and Clooney was already living a careful, controlled life. He hadn't told anyone he was back in LA, not even his agent. That's what made the package feel wrong from the start. Inside was nothing but a single flash drive. No note, no explanation, just a message, unspoken but deafening. We know you're still watching, and now we're watching you. What was on that drive confirmed every nightmare he'd spent years trying to suppress. It was surveillance footage from inside the underground chamber, the circle, grainy black and white video time-stamped. No sound, just a slow, rotating overhead camera capturing every moment like an eye that never blinked. Clooney watched, alone, in his study, as the masked figures moved in ritual, as the velvet flooring reflected the overhead lights, as the nuggets, silent, still, were presented like centerpieces. Then came Diddy. He walked slowly to the center, removed his mask, looked directly into the camera, and smiled. Then, he whispered something. Clooney couldn't hear it, but he could feel it. The clip ended. No jump cuts, no edits, just clean, cold documentation. He played it again, and then he destroyed the original drive. But not before making copies. Because whatever this was, it wasn't a threat to be ignored. It was a line in the sand. Someone wanted him to choose silence or exposure. And this time, he made the choice that scared him most. He decided to speak. Testifying wasn't about revenge. Clooney made that clear. It wasn't about ego or proving anything. It was about truth. About the system that had been hiding in plain sight for too long. He was 63. He had won the awards. He had built the career. But he had never told the truth. Not this truth. And the weight of that silence had become unbearable. So when he took the stand, when he opened that manila folder and slid the sealed evidence across the witness table, it wasn't just about Diddy. It was about every name in that guest book, every masked face in that chamber, every industry power broker who stayed quiet to keep their seat at the table. The courtroom froze, not in confusion, but in recognition. People knew. They had heard whispers. They had seen the clues. But hearing it from Clooney, with that voice, with that weight, turned speculation into reality. This wasn't a conspiracy theory. This was testimony, eyewitness, detailed, documented, and devastating. The reaction wasn't just fear. It was understanding. A dawning realization that the very industry built on storytelling had been living a lie. Clooney wasn't there to entertain. He was there to expose. And in doing so, he tore down the carefully constructed mythos surrounding Diddy and the elite who orbited him. The charm, the swagger, the celebration of his success, it all crumbled under the image of a man in a white robe, raising a glass in a chamber of secrets. Clooney described him not as a man, but as a monarch, a king in a cave, ruling through silence, loyalty, and the fear of exile. But this wasn't just about one man. That's what made Clooney's testimony so powerful. He didn't stop at personal experience. He pointed at the system, the handlers, the PR machines, the studios that cleaned reputations with press junkets and cover stories, the firms that buried rumors with staged photo ops and headline swaps. Hollywood wasn't just broken, Clooney said. It was complicit. Every time someone clapped at an awards show while knowing the truth, they gave the system more power. Every deal made in exchange for silence kept the wheel turning. Fame wasn't just oxygen, it was leverage. And that leverage had created monsters. His message to the press was pointed and unapologetic. You knew. You looked the other way. You printed the red carpet photos while ignoring the smoke behind the curtain. To the studios, he said, you protected profits, not people. To the industry at large, he asked a simple question. If not now, when? Clooney spoke of building a new Hollywood, one that didn't reward complicity, a place where truth didn't mean exile, where young actors didn't have to choose between silence and survival. He knew it was idealistic, but he also knew that culture doesn't shift until someone forces it to. He didn't expect applause. He expected consequences. He said it plainly. I may not make another movie after this. I might lose everything, but I'll finally be able to sleep. And he wasn't exaggerating. Clooney had seen what happens when people try to leave the orbit. He'd watched actors vanish from headlines, musicians dropped from labels, writers lose contracts with no explanation. He called it erasure through absence. No scandal, no accusation, just silence. And he had lived with the fear that he'd be next. But now that fear was replaced by something stronger, a need to end it. His final words weren't dramatic. They were quiet, simple, human. He looked at the jury, the press, the cameras, and said, this wasn't just a cave. It was an operation, hidden in plain sight, and silence is how monsters thrive. That was the call, not just for accountability, but for courage. For everyone in the industry who had seen something, heard something, suspected something, to stop pretending. Clooney wasn't asking for sympathy. He was demanding action. If you were part of it, speak. If you looked away, look again, because now the curtain was pulled back, and whatever comes next would be written by those brave enough to step forward. This wasn't about destroying careers. It was about saving the soul of an industry, about dismantling the pyramid of protection and replacing it with transparency, about building networks not of silence, but of support. Clooney's testimony may have started as a warning, but it ended as a blueprint, a map out of the cave. And the only question that remained was, who else would follow? When George Clooney finished his testimony, The courtroom didn't erupt. It stayed still. That kind of stillness doesn't come from shock anymore. It comes from recognition. Everyone in that room understood something had just shifted, not because of a dramatic confession, but because a man who had nothing left to gain had finally told the truth. Clooney didn't ask to be a hero. He wasn't there to redeem himself. He sat in front of the world and admitted his silence, his complicity, and the cost of living with it. And in doing so, he forced everyone listening to confront a question they'd been avoiding for years. What does it really cost to stay quiet? His journey wasn't linear. It was a slow descent into doubt, fear, and self-erasure, all wrapped in the glow of fame. The cave wasn't just underground. It was inside him. Every time he nodded in public, shook hands at premieres, smiled for cameras next to people he knew were involved, he buried a little more of his truth. That internal fracture didn't happen all at once. It chipped away, until the silence, the watching, the waiting, until that flash drive, that message, made the weight impossible to carry. Clooney made it clear that what he revealed wasn't the full picture. There were names he wouldn't say on the record, details he couldn't disclose in public, not out of fear, but out of caution, for his family, for the process, for the truth to be handled responsibly. But he gave enough to make silence no longer an option for others. He cracked the door open. Now it's up to the rest of the industry to walk through. And what makes this moment different from the hundreds of other scandals and stories that came before is who told it. George Clooney, a man at the top of the pyramid, someone with everything to lose, looked at the camera and said, "I might lose it all, but I'll finally be able to sleep." That line wasn't a soundbite. It was a resignation, a surrender to the fact that sometimes doing what's right means burning down the house that kept you warm. And that kind of courage doesn't go unnoticed. The industry now stands at a crossroad. It can keep pretending this was about one man, one cave, one night. Or it can finally admit what Clooney forced into the light. The real sickness is silence. The real danger isn't what happens in secret chambers. It's what we all ignore in daylight. Clooney's story was more than a confession. It was a mirror. One held up to the press, to studios, to fans, to fellow actors, and even to himself. This testimony may fade from headlines, but the ripple has already started. Whether others step forward or stay silent is no longer about risk. It's about responsibility. Because monsters don't thrive in darkness. They thrive in rooms full of people pretending not to see them. And now, finally, one of Hollywood's biggest stars has looked straight into that darkness and said, "No more." You've just heard George Clooney's truth, a story of fear, fame, and the high cost of silence. If your heart is pounding, if your mind is racing, that's not by accident. This isn't just about Hollywood. It's about every system that thrives when we look the other way. And now, you're part of the conversation. If this moved you, made you angry, or opened your eyes, don't stay silent. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who still believes fame is innocent. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And most importantly, subscribe for the next chapter, because the truth is just getting started. Monsters thrive in silence, but today we make some noise.